Hi guys. Okay, so we are talking about innovativeness and adopter characteristics. This is Rogers chapter 7. And I know a lot of this stuff we've gone through before, but the nice part about this chapter is it really kind of delves into the characteristics and those things that really kind of differentiate one category from the next and allow us to do something with these categories, not just kind of throw people into it, but once we know what they are, what can we do with them? So we start with, the S-shaped curve. So again, we're going to talk about the fact that a lot of adoption, not all, and we've talked about the convex or the R-shaped curve, which is a more dramatic level of, diffusion, much quicker diffusion. This is a more normal S-shaped curve. And then when you look at the frequency distribution, which is where those adopter categories fall, it is a relatively normal distribution. So you're going to see in the middle of the bell-shaped curve, you've got a little more than half of the population of the adopters. And then on the ends, you see kind of a normal distribution of leveling out, where on the one side we've got, 15, 16%, on the other side we have 16%. We just broke the early half into two distinctively different groups. And for good reason, because there's a significant difference between the innovators and the early adopters, which I think if we're going to use these categories effectively in some sort of mechanism like maybe marketing, then we need to be able to leverage the credibility in those early adopters where we don't have the credibility in those innovators. The innovators, Roger says, are more the gatekeeper. They're the ones that introduce innovation into our communities, into our networks, but they're really not respected from an opinion perspective. They are not opinion leaders. So therefore, if we end up spending too much time with innovators, we won't have the credibility we need for the diffusion to move naturally through the S-shaped curve. So anyway, so these are fairly normal distributions, and the S-shaped curve is pretty typical. So the characteristics of adopter categories, what we do here, we're just going to talk more specifically about the early adopters, at least in this slide. The rest of them have, less socioeconomic status. So they have, early adopters, which are the ones that if we want to really influence a diffusion, our innovation needs to really hit home with early adopters because they are the ones that people look for opinion. The one to go to make sure that you're doing the right thing. That's what the early adopter is characterized as. So they're a really important part of a diffusion process. So they tend to have more education, a higher socioeconomic status, which translates more money. Rogers does spend a reasonable time talking about this, so it kind of makes sense, right? So if I've got a lot more disposable income and I decide I'm going to try a new innovation, and let's call it something like agricultural, right? And I'm going to spend a reasonable amount of money on this new pesticide or this new seed, it better work. Or rather, actually, it's okay if it doesn't work because I have a lot of money, I've got some disposable income, and so I can try things out more readily. If a laggard tries this out, it really has to work because he doesn't have a lot of disposable income, and that's why they wait so long to innovate, because they have to be sure this thing works because there's not a lot of income to play around with. So just because I said it in sort of a confusing way, the earlier adopters, so innovators and early adopters, have a higher socioeconomic status. They have more money. They have disposable money that they can invest in an innovation that may or may not pan out. On the other side, the later majority and the laggards have less economic status, less money. And so therefore, it kind of makes sense that I'm going to wait a while, make sure this thing works the way it's supposed to before I invest my, kind of small amount of disposable income. More education means we're just more comfortable with scientific things, new ways of doing things, that sort of audience that might be scary or just very heterophilous to someone in a later majority or laggard category. Upward social mobility, we're more of a cosmopolitan audience. Okay, we go out more. We have people that are, different walks of life, so we get a lot of different information. As a laggard, we're going to spend more time, with our very small circle of people. We may not go very far. I think Rogers had a quote in there, the difference between, the earlier adopters and the later adopters was had to do with trips into like a big city. The earlier adopter had maybe like 30 different trips. The later adopter had less than one. So we just don't have a lot of exposure on the later end of adoption cycle. And so therefore we just don't hear about things until it gets into our, our community, our group of people that we have that intercommunication with. Personality characteristics, greater empathy, less dogmatic, greater ability to deal with abstraction, more favorable attitude towards change, better able to cope with uncertainty. So this is a really big one, okay? Uncertainty, risk. Those in higher, earlier adopter categories have a higher tolerance for risk. And again, we can kind of equate that more to things like socioeconomic status, right? I can take more risks. I have more money, and so therefore I don't worry so much. Later economic status, risk is very scary. Risk could mean that, I don't have enough money for seeds for the next year, or, I spend all my disposable income on some new innovation. So it really matters to that level of risk, where we are comfortable adopting innovations. And under communication behavior, more social participation, wider interpersonal networks. So again, if we have more education, we might have friends from high school, from college, maybe from graduate school, people that are more, more diverse versus, an interpersonal network that maybe is just made up of a small part of my own community, which might also be very small. So we might all be the same race. We might all have the same level of education. Very homophilous, very, very comfortable for a laggard. And therefore, if those people haven't heard of the innovation, well, neither have I. More change agent contacts. So again, this is kind of an interesting thing, and they talk about this, that a lot of change agents spend time with early adopters and innovators. And why? Why? Because they buy it, right? So it's like I don't have to argue and pound my head against the wall. Those people buy the innovation. But think about like where you really want to be. As a change agent, the majority of the money is in the middle. It's in the early majority and the late majority. We've got almost 60% of the population of people that are going to accept this innovation in the middle of the bell curve. And we are spending most of our time on the front end of the curve. So that's a problem that Rogers points out, that this is where the money is. And if you spend too much time, obviously with innovators, innovators are going to be great for giving you some feedback. This works, this doesn't, something like that. But you really have to score well on, early adopters, and then you've got to move aggressively into early majority. Once you get to the end of early majority, of course, most of the rest of the diffusion is going to take care of itself. But you've got to make sure that you're spending time in the right sections in order to maximize the amount of money you're going to make from that innovation. Greater exposure to mass media and social media, for sure. They might have TVs. Rogers talks about some of the people, especially in these developing communities, which didn't even have radios. So their contact with mass media, where you have commercials and things like that, it just didn't happen. And so therefore there was no exposure. And more active information seekers. So they're interested in something new. They want to be, thought of as innovative and having the newest thing. keeping up with the Joneses, right? The Joneses are the ones that are the early adopters, the innovators. And so the rest of us are, just trying to figure out what's cool and, what we can afford. So this is a really important part of what we do with these categories. So when I first read Rogers and I thought, my God, when did he come out with these categories? Because these are still things that are talked about every day in marketing and advertising. The innovators, the early adopters, the early majority. This is well understood, and this is what we use for audience segmentation. So when we're trying to develop messaging to diffuse our innovation, we have to understand that not only do we have different people that are, different from the standpoint of age and demographic status and such, but we also have to take into consideration these adopter categories. So it allows marketers to take advantage of early adopter influence. So if I know that I've got a really cool thing and I've got an early adopter that maybe is famous, right? Like maybe Matthew McConaughey in the Lincoln or something like that, where he or she can influence later majority and early majority and later majority people. We have to understand who that early adopter is that could have an influence over the rest of our diffusion curve. And we've got to choose carefully, right? We're not going to choose someone who's an innovator because those people are not going to have the same level of influence over our majority. So we've got to choose carefully and make sure that that feature spokesperson is appropriate for what we want to do. And allow marketers to develop more effective and specific communication strategies. So not only do we want to, choose the right person, but we've got to choose the right message, right? So we've got a way different message for innovators than we do for the late majority. I would say that we're definitely not messaging in, the laggard category, because by the laggard period, we've probably got a new product that's coming out, and we're back to the innovators to try to figure out how do we get this, into the cycle itself. So I wouldn't say we would, develop a communication for that, but we would certainly have one for the, for early adopters and early majority and probably late majority, because there's just too much population in there to ignore. And those messages are going to be very different. We've got a much different risk tolerance within those. They have different appreciation. They have different monetary levels. So maybe by the time we get to late majority, we're going to be able to cut the costs because we want to, pave the way for the new product. And that would be an effective way to potentially address a late majority adopter. So when we think about what do these do for us and how can we use them, audience segmentation is a huge part of that. And effective diffusion requires very specific messaging. So I want you guys to think about this when you're thinking about your project. Who is your target audience for your diffusion? What type of people are they? How are you going to figure this out? What kind of socioeconomic status do we have? Are they cosmopolitan or not? Or do they have a lot of people that they interact with? Are they risk averse? How can we put a message together that is effective to win them over and get our diffusion to happen? So we want to make sure we take these things into consideration, because I can assure you that they will matter when it comes to the diffusion of your innovation. And that's it.